everybody. Welcome to Oxford Brookes University. We're really grateful to see you all for a very exciting evening of discussion all about how can we have healthy lives. We've had a really tough few years, lots of austerity, lots of global challenges. We're joined today by 4 speakers. I'm going to leave the wonderful Jabu in a minute to introduce everybody, but just do the housekeeping to start with. We're not expecting a fire alarm, but if we do have one, please make your way out there and our wonderful staff will show you the fastest way to get out to the car park. At any time, please do feel free to go and help yourself to tea and coffee. We'll be outside all evening for you. And other than that, we hope you enjoy your time with us. And if you've got any questions for us, please do talk to us afterwards. My name is Dr. Sarah Harricutt. I am the Principal Lecturer for Public Health at Oxford Brookes. So I am somebody who's absolutely passionate about public health on the global stage. We're also joined by our Head of Department, Maxine Fletcher, over there, as well as many of our staff. So please do come and talk to any of us afterwards if you'd like to find out more about what we do here. So, over to you, Jabu, my wonderful Master's Public Health student.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for letting us host this evening for our Masters in Public Health. Today we're joined by our distinguished guests, of whom I would refer to as the legends of public health. They will share with us the wisdom of why public health is important, and also they will really inspire us to know why we've basically chosen this science. Danny, what you said is now happening. Yeah. So we're trying to. Okay, so basically what I wanted to say to you was basically I'm very, very inspired today, especially by the title of this evening. The title of this evening is about healthy lives in the age of insecurity. This took me to a really interesting place because as we were debating with Sarah what to call this evening, what title to use, and when she suggested this title, I immediately thought about The Tale of Two Cities. The Tale of Two Cities is a Dickens novel, if anyone doesn't know, which was written in 1859. In this, I'll give a quote to this Tale of Cities where they say this, where they say it was the age. Sorry. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. I live in Oxford, and I'm a city councillor in an area called Barton, which is an area that is experiencing poverty. So this topic invokes and reflects the tale of two cities for me in terms of how the other half lives in Oxford. This is a tale of two cities. This is a story of the haves and haves not. We have the poor who are living in poverty and are experiencing unhealthy lives. And we have people who are wealthy that are living longer than the poor. So this is the wisdom that we will be exploring with my guests, who are Professor Danny Dorling, Professor Pickett, and Professor Richard Wilkinson. Danny Dorling will explore what the pandemic has revealed about social determinants of public health, and Kate will explore the insecurity and the climate crisis. Richard will look at race and class, how to break the cycle of inequality. And then when they're finished with their presentations, I'd like to invite the audience to participate and we ask questions. So welcome all of you. Right, I would like to first introduce Danny. Sorry. So Danny is a professor in the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. He was previously a professor for a decade at the University of Sheffield and before then at the University of Leeds. He has also worked as an academic in Newcastle and Bristol. He was born and brought up here in Oxford. In 2020, he published Slow Down, The End of the Great Acceleration, and Why It's Good for the Planet, the Economy and Our Lives, and jointly with Annika Koljanen, Fintopia. What we can learn from the world's happiest country. His 2023 book is titled Sheltered Nation. So without further ado, I'll just let Danny just start exploring how the pandemic has really revealed inequality and basically what the social determinants are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming. We're trying to be brave and doing this without any slides, which is quite worrying if you have my kind of job, because you normally hide behind showing pictures. I'm a different generation than Jabu. She's the phone generation. And I said I wouldn't dare do that because somebody might call you while you're reading out from the phone, which is just what happened. If I was to put up one picture about the pandemic, it would be a map of Oxford, and a map that any of you could have accessed, I think, in about the first week of February 2021, when wave 2 of COVID was hitting the country, and wave 2 was far worse than wave 1 in this city. But we were, in a way, fortunate in wave 1. It bypassed Oxford, it went from London to Birmingham in the north. We had relatively low rates of infection in Oxford in March, April, May of 2020. But as we now know, and if you can remember those times, there was an enormous amount we didn't know, a remarkable amount we didn't know. Not getting much in wave 1 simply meant you got more in wave 2 because people had less immunity. The vaccine came remarkably early, but still not until December 2020 for the first person who got it. So January 2021 was too early. You'll have to imagine the map. I've published it. It's from the government dashboard, and it's the rate of infections as measured in different areas of the city, and it was highest, about 8 times higher than the average for the city, in Barton, Blackbird Leys, Rose Hill, and lowest in the most affluent areas. Now, a small part of that reason was that a lot of students, of course, weren't here. But the main reason why the rate was so much higher in the poorer parts of Oxford was because in the poorer parts of Oxford, people were doing those jobs where you actually had to go out to work. That's where the people lived who were working on the tills in the supermarkets, which put you at much greater risk of exposure. It's the people who were fixing the buses, driving the buses, all the contact jobs. It was also where people lived whose family were nearby. And so where grandparents were, who were looking after children who would normally be going to primary school, but the primary schools were shut. You couldn't look after the children yourself because you were going out to work. So the grandparents in those parts of the city were looking after the children, which increases the chance of infection highly. It wasn't anything that was any different from what happened in other cities around the country. But the fact that we had just as big a rate of inequality in Oxford should tell you that this city, I'm feeling good about my aged generation of just paper, that's okay, that this city has just as much an issue when it comes to inequality and poverty as any other. In 2019, an Atlas of Inequality was published by the University of Sheffield, which showed that for Oxford we had an equal proportion of people living in each decile of deprivation for England. So you can make a claim that actually Oxford is the most typical city in some ways of England, which sounds really odd. You might think, oh, this is a really rich city. Well, it isn't when you actually look and measure it. Let's go back to the pandemic and try not to talk for too long. Something dramatic happened before the pandemic, which really, really matters. Around about 2012, the life expectancy of women aged above 65 dropped by 2 weeks. Sounds very small, but for decades, life expectancy had been rising and rising. It dropped for 2 weeks for women in 2012 because women were much more likely to be living on their own. And when government cuts Meals on Wheels deliveries, when it cuts rural bus routes, when it cuts adult social workers who come round and check you're okay, that affects elderly women more than elderly men, because elderly men are much more likely to be living with a woman. Elderly women are more likely to end up living on their own. Those deaths from austerity rose in 2013, 14, dramatically in 2015, a bit more in 2016, 2017, 2018 was very bad. Life expectancy was lower in this country in 2015, 16, 17 and 18 for both men and women than it had been in 2014. Nowhere else in Europe saw this. The United States did. The government blamed it on an infectious disease called influenza, a special kind of flu that we kind of only got here. It wasn't true. Initially, the estimates were 120,000 people died early, and they rose and rose. Life expectancy projections from the Office of National Statistics fell and fell and fell, and then a pandemic hits. That's the circumstances in which the pandemic hit us. Other countries in Europe didn't have this. They had a population that was becoming healthier. They didn't have a health service which was being decimated. But if you remember in 2015, I think, and 2018, routine operations being cancelled across all hospitals because of problems directly related to funding, so they couldn't cope. And then an infection comes into the country when you already have a system that isn't coping anyway. It's being revealed now through the public inquiry. You don't need me to tell you what they were thinking and how they were behaving, because they've been forced, their WhatsApp messages tell you what they think. The WhatsApp messages from the inquiry tell you that the Prime Minister thought that some people were not worth keeping alive, that it wasn't a bad thing that they were going. We know that Matt Hancock really did think he had some kind of godly power to decide who lives and dies. The biggest error was about nursing homes. Eventually the inquiry hopefully will produce an estimate of what might have been possible if we'd done better. But, and I'll only get another couple of minutes, people often tell you, if you make comparisons amongst European countries, we don't look that bad. There's a reason why we don't look, we look bad, but not right at the worst end of it. The reason why we don't look at the very worst end is that COVID, above all else, was a disease which affected you by age. The key thing was not to be in your 90s. We lost 15% of all men in their 90s. in the first 2.8 years of COVID. 10%, 1 in 10 of all women in their 90s in this country died directly because of COVID. Next most high in your 80s, then your 70s. I was 100 times less likely to die than my father, because I'm 55 and he's now 80. My now 22-year-old son was 100 times less likely to die than me, or 10,000 times less likely to die than my father. Everybody's alive in my family from this. But that 10,000-fold difference was incredible. It's principally about age, and then about sex. Men 50% more likely to die than women, despite being less likely to actually catch it, because men are not quite so good at being sociable. It's an advantage when there's an infectious disease. Why does this matter? Because we'd had those years of austerity before, so we had fewer people in their 90s and 80s because they died earlier because of how bad our health service had become, how people gave up, there was increased despair. So when they tell you on some comparison that the numbers of people who died from COVID were not particularly high, that's because so many had already died from austerity. The pandemic's continuing. It carries on. It's a series of waves. Vaccination has a huge, we need to talk about vaccination, huge effect. And repeated infection is similar to it. We're slowly learning the lessons, although we're slightly in a kind of after the war mood, I think, at the moment, of it's gone away, let's not talk about that, let's not. I'll tell you one very depressing thing, and then one thing I found slightly more amusing to end with. The depressing thing is that very luckily the city had opened up its second crematoria. That really mattered. We had a death rate which was almost identical in wave 2, January, February, March 2021, to the death rate in India at that time. And you might remember the pictures from India, and it's outdoor cremations in India. We're very British. We don't talk about it. Happens quietly, but we had a death rate similar to India. Luckily, Oxford had 2 operating crematoria rather than the first at Barton, which, by the way, was one of the first in the country from the crematorium movement. The slightly more uplifting or amusing thing, I found it amusing. When we were studying this disease, because we knew about SARS, it had a 30% death rate. If you have a 30% death rate, you stop a disease. You have to. People are petrified. If it's a common cold that's been around for some time, it's much less damaging. This one was in between. Not terrifying enough to shut everything down, and you can't shut everything down. Zero COVID was impossible. But not so mild as to be like the 1968 flu pandemic, the last one we had of any significance. When we were looking at it first, we didn't even know it's going to come back. There was a chance that enough people had caught it and the immunity might last for years, that we wouldn't get a big wave 2. When wave 2 came, it came in from outside. By August 2020, the amount of COVID in this country was absolutely tiny, very hard to measure. It came back first into Eton. When the boys flew into Eton from abroad, that's where it first came. I'm not blaming the public schools, but it's a bit like it first came from... the reason why there was a lot of COVID in Westminster at the point when Dominic Cummings decided to drive to County Durham was that people who go skiing in Italy tend to come from certain neighbourhoods. But the second place it came into in the autumn of 2020, the beginning of wave 2, was here, the University of Oxford, because we had some students coming in. However, the government produces these graphs of all the people being tested by time on the bottom and age on the side, and it comes in amongst the age group 20 to 30, but it doesn't spread. This is October, November, goes away and then comes in again. Exactly the same graph for Cambridge, but not for any other district in the country. So what's going on? And it's, in a way, it's a rather sad story, or because the students had COVID, it was moving around amongst them. They weren't mixing with anybody outside the students. Right? There are various ways in which we measure social interaction of young people using social media. I won't go into how we have an idea about how much young people interact with other young people, but you can guess. But there's no better way of measuring interaction between young people than an infectious disease. And it turns out that this city is so divided that a disease where the fastest way to transfer it is, well, small children hugging. But there are things you can do that transfer a disease faster than hugging. Doesn't happen in this city. And in a way, that meant that it came later to most of the population. But it's kind of sad that we actually know that there is so little mixing between people of the same age that occurs. In a way funny, but in a way a mess. And the fact that it's only Oxford and Cambridge that showed that shows you just how utterly divided. Our last one's about levels of not understanding ourselves. Maybe I'm not making up. I set an exam question that year. And the exam question was, who was most affected by the pandemic in the city of Oxford? And the most common answer I got was, we were. The students wrote, we were affected. It was terrible. I had to stay at home. I couldn't do this. I caught it. I was ill. The students, the standard answer they gave, and admittedly they hadn't had a lecture about it because it had just happened. Right? The exam question, who was most affected in the city of Oxford? And the typical answer of students is them, which shows how much people don't understand about a disease that their grandparents were 10,000 times more likely to die of than them. That they and their grandparents were much less likely to get because they were isolated in larger homes because they didn't have to interact with people. This disease swept through London with the highest mortality rate in Europe, in parts of London. Next, New Haven and New York were similar. In the country, it swept through Manchester and Liverpool and concentrated areas. It took a long time to get to Cornwall. It's something we need to learn from and not forget. The death toll from COVID, because it continues, has surpassed the 1968 flu and the 1957 flu. We don't know the long-term effects yet, but, and this is what I'll end on, it's still small compared to the deaths and premature lives ended by austerity. And we now know, thanks to work from the Financial Times, that deaths from austerity continued to actually occur even during COVID, and then more so afterwards. It's not a happy story. We have a terrible record in this country, with recent data in the last week coming out showing it getting worse. We have to accept this and realise that we now have one of the lowest life expectancies in Europe. There's only 5 countries in East Europe which have a higher neonatal mortality rate than us, and you have to accept it. But the positive thing is the only way is up. But when I was born, this city, 1968, we had the lowest infant mortality rate in the world, in the country. And this city had, I think, the lowest in the country because we had baby incubators at the JR. We were ahead of everybody else. And we've gone to this situation now, which we're told is inevitable, as long as you don't look at every other country in Europe and how they dealt with things. So it's a bit depressing, We mustn't forget about it. The public inquiry, thanks to a judge being robust and demanding that she be allowed to get those messages, they didn't think she was going to be that robust when they appointed her, has actually revealed what the attitudes of people in charge are. And it's because of their attitudes that this situation has been allowed to happen. Thank you very much for letting me pontificate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Danny, for really highlighting the real issues that a lot of us were not led to understand. I remember I was one of those people, some people who know me, who went into action and wanted to really fight around vaccinations, especially the hysteria around a lot of black communities not wanting to vaccinate. I was one of the people that was really robustly fighting for people to actually go and get the vaccination so that they can protect themselves. We really didn't understand the kind of epidemiology that you have explained, which a lot of the people wouldn't, we just basically thought the people that were mostly affected were people that were in sort of high density communities where association, where there's lack of space, would end up with the highest rates of mortality. So it's quite interesting to hear how your interpretation of what was happening with the epidemic and the aftermath, and the fact that this is a long, ongoing issue. I'm going to move to Professor Kate Pickett, who's going to really look at poverty and insecurity, and especially around climate crisis. Professor Kate is a professor of epidemiology and a deputy director of a Center for Future Health, and she's an associate director at Nottingham Center.
Try that one. Don't even bother trying to read that.
Nottingham Center. And
nobody knows what it means anyway, not even me.
Okay. But the important thing is that she's a co-author of Spirit Level with Richard Wilson here, who's her husband. Sorry to say that. Sorry.
That's fine.
I shouldn't have said sorry. It's nothing to be sorry about. And also the Inner Level in 2018. Kate is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, a fellow by distinction of the UK Faculty of Public Health, and a fellow of the British Academy of Social Sciences. She was also awarded an OBE in the US Honours List this year, 2023. So without further ado, Kate.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think it's actually important to know that we're married, because then if we like nudge each other or follow each other's hands or say stop now, you know where it's come from. Also, I can steal these quotes and that's okay.
Control is much more likely to go from Kate to me than vice versa.
You can all judge that for yourselves. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight, and thanks Danny for all of your words so far. I thought I'd talk about children to start with. We've only got one with us today in the audience, but quite often I think people don't talk about children so much in discussion about society and the economy and what's going on. And although we're not going to or PowerPoint, I will give you a couple of numbers. It doesn't really matter if you don't remember them. But Richard often talks about statistics, and a lot of people don't like statistics, or they think they don't like statistics. You're nodding because your students probably tell you that well. They think they don't like statistics. You too. But actually,
statistics,
they're wonderful. They're wonderful things. And Richard describes statistics as a social microscope. They're what allows you to look at things, to compare things, to have a sort of lens on things. So if you're a biologist and you want to understand things, you look down a microscope. But with statistics, you've got a big sort of social lens, and you can understand things that are happening by using those numbers. And you said that maybe we don't look so bad if you look at us in comparison to Europe in terms of pandemic and COVID deaths, but actually in some comparisons, when you compare Britain, when you compare the UK to other countries, we look shockingly bad. And UNICEF, the United Nations body that looks after the rights and well-being of young people throughout the world, does what it calls an index of child well-being every few years for rich countries. It compares how well children are doing across a whole range of indicators, across a whole range of rich countries. And in the last one, which came out just before the pandemic, we came 29 for the mental well-being of our children. So 28 countries were doing better than we were. We came 19 for physical well-being, so 18 countries are doing better than us. And we came 26 for skills, so 25 countries doing better than us. We are the 5th richest economy in the world, and there we are rolling on along at 29, 19, 26 for our children. And it's interesting that you mentioned the infant mortality rate. Epidemiologists like us think about the infant mortality rate as a sort of canary in the coal mine. It's a single statistic that's measured quite well, generally, and it responds quite quickly to changing environments and circumstances. So it's quite a good indicator of the health of the public. And you said Oxford used to be top. Yeah. Well, we used to be quite near the top of the international league table on infant mortality rate. So in 1960, there were only 5 countries that had a lower infant mortality rate than we had. So we were ranking 6th, which was pretty good.
Yeah, and they were tiny.
They
were tiny countries.
Yeah.
They all had lower population combined than we did.
So we were doing really, really well.
Yeah.
So we were 6th in 1960. 10 years later, we dropped to 8th. 10 years on from that, we dropped to 9th. By 1990, we were 10th. By 2000, we were 15th. By 2010, we were 18th. And by 2020, we were 21st. So we had just dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped in the international sort of league tables of our infant mortality rate. We lose about 3,000 children a year in the UK, infants and older children. And, you know, the agony of that for families. Now, for most of that period where our ranking's going down and down, the infant mortality rate's actually dropping, but it's dropping faster in other places than it is for us. So we're sort of falling behind. But that stopped with austerity. We actually saw the mortality rate in this country start to go up. It went up first for those lower down the social ladder. But since about 2014, you can see it for everybody. So that canary in the coal mine is singing pretty loudly about what's happening to the health of our population over time. And so we've ended up in this parlour state with this really sad set of statistics about how well our children are doing. Why are they doing so poorly? Because this is an unequal country with high rates of poverty. That's what it comes down to. We have 4.3 million children living in poverty in this country. 31%. 31% in the 5th richest country in the world are living in poverty. And we're actually in 31st place for child poverty among rich nations. And some of you will have seen that report that came out from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, I'll get to in a second, okay, on destitution. Did some of you hear about that a couple of weeks ago? The numbers of children we've got who are actually living in families that are destitute, meaning they can't afford the basic necessities of life.
I was just wondering if you could tell us the number of countries that were kind of classified in the UNICEF study. So, how many rich countries?
Oh, right. So 29th out of how many?
Yeah.
32 or something like that. I mean, we're really near the bottom. Yeah. The first time they did that index, we came absolute bottom. Absolute bottom. And since then, we've moved up a bit because they've added some poorer countries underneath us. So, millions of children in millions of families living with poverty and destitution in this country. And I think it's really important to remember that that lack of material resources is interacting and intersecting, that poverty is interacting and intersecting with all kinds of other inequalities. So some of them are geographic. So you've talked about the divide here in Oxford, the tale of two cities. All British cities are like that. All British cities have areas of deprivation and poverty, cheek by jowl with great wealth and affluence. I do a lot of work on the gap between the north and the south because the scale of that divide is pretty large. We have areas in the north where more than 45% of children are living in poverty. And that's a sort of long-standing divide. But every city has got those inequalities. Some groups of people are more likely to be living in the poorer parts of some cities. So black and minoritized ethnic populations are more likely to be living in poverty. They are more likely to be part of those statistics that we're talking about. Infant mortality is much higher for black and Pakistani heritage families than it is for any others. So there's this complete sort of intersection of inequalities of wealth and income and education and power sort of intersecting with those inequalities of where you live and who you are and the groups that you belong to. And what we've seen since 2010 in this reign of austerity, this long period, going on for 14 years now of austerity, is that the cuts that we've seen to our public services have been worse in the areas with the greatest need. I mean, that's perhaps one of the most shocking things that I'm going to say. So if you look at a graph of where local authority cuts were deepest per person, it lines up with the areas with the highest child poverty. Higher cuts in areas with more child poverty. If you look at cuts to Sure Start centres, and those were the centres that were supposed to help our children have a better start in life, give them the resources they needed, the cuts were deeper in the south per child that was eligible than they were in the north. And we saw Sure Start centres just sort of go to the wall and close down. So all of those cuts hit hardest in the areas where they were most needed. And what that's ended up with for us is a population where too many people are living in cold homes, damp homes, overcrowded homes, insecure homes. And if you don't know whether or not your housing is secure, that is one of the biggest psychological stresses that you can think about. The fear that you might become homeless, the fear that you might lose your home. Being homeless is not a lifestyle choice. And too many people, of course, in our population are facing that fear from week to week. And imagine being a child and trying to manage your transition to adulthood, studying at home. If your house is cold, you haven't got anywhere to study, your house is damp. We know that people haven't got enough to eat, that too many people are hungry. Often it's parents who are hungry because parents will feed their children before they feed themselves. And over the course of the cost of living crisis, I've been working with a large group of researchers in Europe, but some of them are working with people across the country, talking to people who are suffering at the sharp end of the cost of living crisis, hearing about how they're managing their food budgets or not, hearing about their troubles with keeping the heating on, feeling desperate, there's nothing more they can cut down on, talking about the shame of going to a food bank, talking about what it feels like to be in that kind of need. Debts are rising. Debt is an enormous psychological stressor for adults, but kids always know when their parents are struggling for money and when that is going on as well. And all of this, of course, is stressing people's relationships. It's stressing people's abilities to be kind to one another, to look out for one another. People are really at breaking point. And we have heard over the last couple of years the kinds of stories that make me ashamed of my country and ashamed to see the government doing what it's doing and ashamed to sort of be silent while that's going on. I used to work in America. I worked in America for 16 years of my adult life. And I feel embarrassed now to admit that I used to feel a bit smug when I was working in America, because I used to think, well, at least I come from a country that doesn't have food banks. At least I come from a country that has a social security net. You know, at least I come from a country that doesn't let people go needing medical care and not provide it. Have no recourse to any kind of social security. And that's gone. I came home to a changed country, and since I came home, it's got worse. I like the title you chose for this session about healthy lives, but I think what we need for healthy lives are healthy livelihoods, and you can't have one without the other. And next week I'm supposed to take part in a session on precision medicine and health inequalities. And precision medicine is where you tailor a treatment to a particular individual. And it's just rubbish, idea really, because what we need is actually to be protecting and promoting the health of a population. And one of the colleagues that I work with quite a lot said to me, the best precision medicine there is money. Money is the best precision medicine you could have. So we've all been watching the COVID inquiry unroll. We've all been watching the antics displayed of government. We've all seen exposed to us the cruelty that has been expressed there, the lack of empathy. When you live in a divided country and you have people like our current government at the head of it, they don't know how we live actually. They don't know how you live, they don't know how we live, they don't know what parts of our cities are like, they don't come, they don't look, they don't care. If you ask them if they care about children, they'll say that they do. But they don't care about your children. They care about their own. So I think we're probably at a turning point as we move into a new year. I hope so. Possibly we've got an opportunity for changes of policy, changes of emphasis. But possibly not, and we're going to have to keep the pressure on. And I realise I haven't mentioned climate change once, so we'll have to come back to that in the discussion, and maybe you'll talk about it. But I think I'll stop now with all those woeful statistics. But I'm hopeful that we might see some changes in the coming year, and that we can all be part of the pressure that will create those opportunities for change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kate. Listening to you, I'm just sitting here thinking, these are the type of reasons that pushed me to wanting to become a councillor, because I wanted to do a lot for my community, Barton, which has been mentioned a couple of times, because it is an area of deprivation in Oxford. One of the stories that always touched me about Barton was coming across a young man who had been stabbed at a very young age, and he was carrying a knife. I spoke to him about this. He carried a knife out of fear. Young man of small stature. Basically, you could see that he felt he couldn't defend himself. And I was there trying to pull my hair, thinking, what can we do? What sort of intervention so that young men like this don't feel that they have to carry knives And as a result, that young man has ended up in prison. But also being on the bus, number 8 bus that comes from Barton, passes here in Oxford Brookes to town, you get to meet a lot of people and have conversations around what is going on. And usually the people who normally talk to you are the old people, old age people. And it is so sad to hear old people saying, I only put my heating on for an hour. I cannot afford to heat my home. And I'm thinking, wow, you know, this is, as you said, this is the UK. This is the UK. When I first came to this country, I saw the relative poverty, because you tend to compare it with, say, an African country just for absolute poverty. But to actually see people now solely relying on food banks, children starving in Europe, it was unheard of. And if you go back to visit places like South Africa, and people are always trying to come over to England, and if you give them this narrative about people starving, they really find that hard to comprehend. So thank you for highlighting this issue and making us understand what these inequalities mean for all of us, not just the Oxford area, the whole world, globally. So I'll now move on to Richard Wilkinson. As I said earlier, Richard and Kate are married. So basically, it's a public health house. Richard will talk about how we can really break the cycles of inequality and hopefully bring in race and class in the conversation. So just a little bit of background about Richard. He is an Emeritus Professor of Social Epidemiology at the University of Nottingham Medical School. He is also an Honorary Professor at the University of London and an Honorary Visiting Professor at the University of York. So from 1976 onwards, his career has focused on research into social class differences in health, the social determinants of health, and on the health and social effects of income and inequality. So I won't go any further and give this to Richard.
Thank you. Good. I want to describe a little bit what I think is a misunderstood area of the damage that inequality does to us. I think people generally understand the impact of poverty, not in detail. It's easy to imagine the effects of poor housing and poor food and air pollution and so on is usually worst in the poorest areas. Those material factors related to poverty, I think, are much more widely understood, part of people's understanding of health. I want to talk about the psychosocial factors that I think are extremely important of why inequality matters too. When I talk about inequality, I'm thinking primarily of income differences, income and wealth differences, the material inequalities between us. People often say, what about gender and ethnic inequalities and so on? I don't think those are entirely different. I mean, if you think of, basically when something characteristic becomes a marker of low social status, people suffer the same kind of stigma, being looked down on and regarded as inferior as if you're poor. So, if you're regarded as inferior because of the religious group you belong to, or because of your accent, or the linguistic group you belong to in different societies, or your skin colour, you suffer much of the same stigma that I think explains why there are psychosocial effects of poverty. And basically, when I talk about inequality, income inequality, I mean, I want people to regard it as a social relationship. Now, basically, inequality puts us in a hierarchy. From, we imagine the most capable at the top and the most incapable at the bottom, and it hurts to be low down because you feel regarded as inferior, looked down on and disrespected and so on. And I think we have to understand these material differences between us as making class and status more important. It raises the stakes, and you can see that in a lot of different ways. I mean, Kate and I have shown that most of the problems with social gradients, the problems that are worst in the poorest areas, tend to get worse across almost the whole population when the income differences increase. So, also those sociologists have spent a lot of time sort of dividing the population, arguing about how we should be identifying different classes or naming them. I think what matters is the distance between us. The idea that the material differences between us increase the social distances. Those feelings of superiority and inferiority, which I think chime or echo with deep evolutionary psychology issues to do with dominance and subordination, if you think about monkey hierarchies and so on. So think of inequality not just in terms of the effects of material poverty or wealth at the other end, but as things that add to our insecurity, our worries about how other people judge us. Do they think you're successful and capable and so on, or do you feel people look down on you and this kind of thing? And interestingly, there was a very important study which interviewed people in poverty in different countries, in rich countries and poor countries. And of course in the poorest countries, they interviewed people in Pakistan and India and in East Africa, as well as people in Norway and Britain. People who in those societies were classified as poor. And what they found is, although they were living in the poor were living in extraordinarily different conditions, whether they lived in Norway or in Pakistan, say, people experienced the poverty. They found the interviewers were collecting information on how people experienced poverty, which was very similar. So they felt, whether they lived in Pakistan or Norway, that they were looked down on for being poor. They were disrespected. They felt they'd failed themselves, failed their families. The study even talked about self-hatred as a matter of, as an effect of poverty, of inequality, sorry. So what matters is not simply your material circumstances, it's where you are in relation to others. And we see this running through all sorts of data. And one of the things that's been shown again and again and again, I mean dozens and dozens of studies, is that violence goes up with inequality, measured just by homicide rates. And the reason for why it goes up with more inequality seems to be that people are, homicide is triggered, violence is triggered by people feeling disrespected, loss of face, humiliation. It's because status becomes more important and we all become more sensitive to it. When studying health inequalities from the 1970s onwards, when we began to, sorry, I'm losing my thread here. Yeah, I don't know how I got to. Yeah. And you see this, the anxiety about status. A higher proportion of the population in more unequal countries are going in for a process called self-enhancement. So if you ask people in different societies, how do you compare with the average in your country on, say, how intelligent you are? Do you think you're cleverer than most people in Britain? You ask them a number of questions, and the joke one is, do you think you're better drivers than average? And I think over 90% of Americans think they're better drivers than the average. But in more unequal societies, you find people talk themselves up, they big themselves up. They go in for a process of sort of self-advertisement, self-enhancement, psychologists call it. And you also see that people consume more status goods. There are now a number of studies in different countries which show if you live in a more unequal area, you put more of your money into sort of ostentatious goods, goods that show you off well. You buy a better car than other people, or you wear clothes that have designer labels. Because you become more worried about how you're seen and judged, you go in for these processes to big yourself up. Now, yeah, that's where I got lost just now. When we first started realizing that chronic stress was a powerful influence on health, on physiology, affecting the immune system, the cardiovascular system, many other biological systems, of course we began to wonder, what are the most important sources of chronic stress? And at first we thought unemployment, losing your home, maybe having someone close to you going into prison, these kinds of things. But actually, if you're thinking about the whole population, fortunately those things are a smaller percentage of the population. The really big things that we all feel are these worries about how we're seen and judged. The anxieties, if you go out to a party or something, will you know anyone there? What will they think of me? Will I be able to think of anything sensible to say? Those sorts of social anxieties. And we know that some people are completely undone by these anxieties, so they avoid social meetings, become quite isolated and depressed as a result. Others go into the process I was describing earlier of talking themselves up. So if I'm worried about what you think of me, I tell you I went to a very good university, or I got promoted very young, or what it is, whatever. And I find little stories I can tell you about. Each one appears to be a joke, but actually there's a subtext. It's a way of telling you that this happened while I was going up to get my prize for something or other. And I sat through so many, I remember noticing, particularly in the States, dinner parties, which consist of endless little stories, each meant to be funny, but each having something in which is a sort of assertion of social status. And I think I'm in two minds whether to read. I think I will. I think people are hesitant to admit how important these social status things are to them. How worried we are about how we're seen and judged. And I put together a list of words, expressions, phrases, which we use to describe status differences, which I think shows how obsessed we are. And it's rather like, the Inuit have so many 50 words for snow or something. because snow is really, and the quality of the snow, really important. It matters to them. We have that sort of number of words to do with status differences. And obviously, snobbish, conceited, smug, superior, patronising, stuck-up, snooty, arrogant, condescending, affected, toffee-nosed, self-important, big-headed, narcissistic, haughty, inferior, jumped-up, common, posho, underling, menial, brown-nosed, obsequious, sycophantic, grovelling, kowtowing, cringing, above himself, taking on airs and graces, looked down on, up himself, bowing and scraping, sucking up to, stuffed shirt, pretentious, ostentatious, affected, la-di-da, scum, hoi polloi, proles, the great unwashed, the filthy rich, ostentatious and showy. They all show not only an obsession with status differences, but how much we dislike them. They're all expressions of disapproval. And so we must think about inequality and the material differences affected by things like tax avoidance, tax regimes and so on, and minimum wages and all the rest of it, which make these psychosocial things worse in the population. And you see how that leads to a decline in community life, a decline in trust. People less likely to know their neighbours, less likely to trust each other, less likely to be involved in local community life. And what's so tragic about it is when you look at the studies of happiness and well-being, of course, amongst the most important factors are the quality of social relationships between us. Not only really important for well-being, but really powerful determinants of health. Whether or not you're involved in community life, have good relationships, lots of friends, is at least as important to your survival in a follow-up period as whether or not you smoke. You know, these are powerful influences on mortality. And yet, it is exactly that area that inequality does its damage. There are now lots of papers which show the decline in community life, the decline in trust, the rise in violence. And I think almost certainly an increase in our obsession with the status differences, our worries about them, and as that all gets more important, our worries about how other people see and judge us. So it increases the idea that some people are much more important than others, and so we worry more about how we're seen and judged. So I should say just a little bit about what I think changes inequality in the long term. And if you look at the 20th century, you see income inequality falling from some time, I think Danny says even just before the First World War, but you see it very obviously in lots of data sets. From sometime in the 1930s, income inequality declining, it goes on declining all the way through until the late 1970s. And then from 1980, you get the modern rise of inequality so rapidly under Thatcher during the 1980s. And if you look, for instance, at membership of trade unions, not just in Britain, but in one country after another, you find it has just the inverse relationship. Income inequality declines as trade unions are membership is getting stronger. And trade union membership peaks around the time when inequality is lowest. And then trade union membership falls away and inequality starts to rise. And I think what the message from that is not necessarily that it's driven entirely by what trade unions do for your wages, but in a way trade union membership is a sign of the strength of the whole labour movement, the idea that there's another way society can work, which is better for all of us. The strength of that sort of countervailing movement in our society. How often people will hear, I was going to say trade union leaders with good research departments so they know the data on question time or programs like that, any of the discussions, and we hear less and less of that idea that society doesn't have to work like this. And yet, of course, when socialism, socialist thinking, the threat of communism was important, it was good for capitalism. It was when the threat of communism was greatest that countries built the welfare states. It made capitalism more humane. And as that threat ebbed away, we get that rise in inequality. Thatcher, who allowed drove the inequality upwards, of course said there is no alternative, which is why she could drive it up. And I think you have to regard income inequality as something, and if we're going to make big changes in it, it means a very powerful, enduring social movement. Kate said she hadn't mentioned climate change. It's very clear that if we're going to deal with the climate crisis, we have to have greater inequality. Much the biggest footprints come from the super rich, of course. And if you just put up the price of petrol or things dependent on fossil fuels, you get protests. The obvious example is the Gilets jaunes. Remember the protests in France when Macron put up the price of, or proposed putting up the price of petrol. Months and months of protests in cities all over France saying it was unfair. And I think people are not going to stand for effective measures against climate change if they believe that the rich can go on having their private jets and living a lifestyle that is so costly. I should have written some figures down so I could tell you the differences. Do you remember them? No. Okay. I will stop now. But I hope that maybe concern for dealing with the climate crisis will lead to simultaneous attempts to diminish the income differences amongst us, because we just won't be able to, the populations won't accept it without feeling that it's fair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Richard. I particularly kind of really felt your message when you were talking about the stigma and status. One of the biggest things, as Jenny was outlining what was happening during lockdown, was that as we were going around poor neighborhoods and knocking people, trying to find people that we could support with food insecurity and giving them various parcels, there's quite a lot of pride in the poor areas where people felt, the stigma of, being given food, because people naturally want to work for things. We don't want to be seen as the kind of words that we use, some of them are like scrounger, which are really demeaning to certain people. I remember particular families would be so apologetic in taking the food as they were receiving favour, or their favour was late, and these were people that were low-paid workers. So it's been a really interesting conversation around inequality. And now I'd like to bring in the audience here. If anybody's got a question, So I would also like to remind people just to keep their questions to minimum so that we can give other people a chance to also give their feedback on what they thought of our conversation today. Do we have any questions? Okay, I'll take Steve. How many shall I take each?
Two.
Okay. All right. Okay, Steve and sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah. Can I get the question, Steve?
I just want to know why did the numbers for the unions decline so drastically in the 70s? I know Thatcher did some policies, but why did so many workers just stop joining them and stop
Well,
getting
of course,
involved with?
right at the beginning of Thatcher's period, there was the miners' strike, and the previous government under Heath had there had been a miners' strike, and he had called an election. We had power cuts and so on, and I think Thatcher felt a prime task for her was to break the unions, and so there was not just in Britain but many countries anti-union legislation passed to prevent sympathy strikes and things like that, and the legislation about the voting for strikes, and that it should be secret ballots, whereas unions had always had a show of hands in large assemblies, and you get different results depending on whether your vote is seen by other people or not.
But a cultural shift, it wasn't just things being done. Part of that whole neoliberal, individualistic, greed is good kind of culture was very just around unions. So I think it wasn't just that things were imposed on unions, like different rules. I think it was more that shift away from solidarity and...
I think that the whole change to neoliberal economics from Thatcher and Reagan is crucially important. It was an international ideology, and as I said, it coincides with the collapse of communism. Although those countries the regimes didn't fall until 1990, and the inequality really rose dramatically in one country after another from about 1980. By the early in the 1960s, people had regarded the communist countries as a serious economic threat. Even the CIA said those countries were going faster than the West. I remember Khrushchev coming to the UN and saying, "We will bury you." He banged the lectern with his shoe, and we thought he meant that we will outgrow you, we will be more powerful. And so it was a real threat, but by the 1980s, the situation had changed. We knew those countries were economic basket cases. The threat had gone. And I think that was crucial in the rise of neoliberalism.
Thank you, Richard. Do you have an alternative to that?
No, except I thought, let me give you just a tiny bit of hope, because we've kind of gone down quite a way. Because unexpected things happen, which aren't necessarily all about the things you might plan or organise. A quarter of a century ago, with colleagues, we wrote a book called The Widening Gap, and it had a series of pictures in it about the places doing best and worst in the UK. And by far the worst was Glasgow, and in particularly Glasgow Shettleston had the worst rates on everything. And if you can remember Scotland back, it was particularly hit. It lost its industry in 1977 first. The jobs went on the Clyde and so on. It had the worst rates of everything it compared with some of the poorest parts of Europe. Kate mentioned 45% of children in the northeast being poor now, of England. Scotland has for at least a decade had a lower rate of child poverty, not just in the north of England, it's got a lower rate of child poverty than the whole of the South East where we are. And that would have been unbelievable to have said that this could have happened. Scotland, of course, has kept the payment. If you have 3 children, you still get child benefit for the 3rd child. As does Northern Ireland, which we never talk about, why we never took it away from Northern Ireland. Something happened in Scotland which had to do with devolution and being allowed to be in charge more, but also an increase in respect for each other. I hope that the COVID inquiry will contrast the behaviour of those English men about what happened when they were in charge in Whitehall and what they said with what happened in Scotland. Because you would have watched, because there wasn't much to do when you're locked up, the hours of BBC 24 coverage. And they actually clicked on quite often to the press conference by Nicola Sturgeon, and she obviously actually cared. I sometimes thought she cared too much. I thought, how on earth are you going to cope with this? But, you know, clearly she and a lot of ministers in Scotland were not thinking the same things that we now know they were thinking in England. Not just about COVID, which was hard to control and what you could do, but when the cost of living crisis began, they convened the Cobra committee every week that they'd done for COVID for the cost of living crisis. And Scotland brought in controls on landlords so that people couldn't be evicted. But Kate mentioned precision medicine, and the best precision medicine being money. They brought in a special payment in Scotland for children because they didn't have the freedom to do everything because they're still controlled by London. And initially it was £10 a week if you had a child under 6 and you got any form of benefit. A year ago, November 2022, that was raised to £25 a week for every child you have under the age of 16, for every household claiming any kind of benefit. That means that by now, literally by today, those families that have claimed it, which is almost all the families as far as we yet know, will have received, if they got 3 children, £3,900 extra. It's not tapered, you don't lose other benefits because of it. £3,900 extra in a year, if you're careful, is just about enough to ensure that your children do not go cold or hungry. And that's just happened. It's just happened in the last year. It's happened within...
the cost of living payments you're talking about, or the
No, this is...
payment towards heating and electric?
No, that's the kind of things we get in England, which are kind of minimal compared to... This is a special payment you only get in Scotland.
Oh, right, okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you have to be in Scotland to get this. Nothing else is taken away. You're getting all the other benefits that you get, but on top of that, you get this extra money. Almost £4,000 if you've got 3 kids, which just means the hunger and the cold goes. And it's that increase in solidarity that has occurred in people in Scotland seeing each other as people, not seeing other people as disposable.
It's
now,
popular as well.
It's very popular, so popular that when Gordon Brown last summer tried to say maybe it was a bad idea because it's inefficient because the Scots they have to organise all the admin themselves, you know, and it'd be better if it. When Gordon Brown tried to attack it, which is very telling about politics, the Scottish Labour Party told him to be quiet. So there is still unanimous agreement in Scotland at the moment, and it's fractious, of course, between the Labour Party in Scotland and the Scottish National Party that this should happen and then not to argue about the children. Not just that, but in Wales, the Commissioner for Child Poverty, I think in Wales, suggested why it's working so well in Scotland, why not introduce it in Wales? The cost is minimal. The cost is actually tiny, or a fraction of the corruption over PPE and COVID in England. But what you get is that people ignore the billions of pounds corruptly spent on that and talk about a camper van in Scotland, a single camper van, to distract you from what was achieved. And this has happened in the UK in the last 12 months. Things that are entirely possible and having a huge material effect. I'll give you one more depressing one and I'll shut up, but why it matters. If you think we're talking about abstract statistics, although some of these are about death, which is the heights of children. Heights of children are rising in France and they're rising in Germany. The heights of children by the age of 5 have been falling in the UK as a whole since those born in 2005, and that date matters because that began under the last Labour government. Slight, but there, accelerated under austerity. When your children are not growing to the same heights as children a few years earlier, you know something is going very, very badly wrong. But I just wanted to give the Scottish example. It doesn't just have to be things that worked in the past, although all the international evidence shows that the more people who join trade unions, the better your country does for most people. Other things can help as well. But kowtowing to accepting this particular way of thinking, which has so completely been shown to be devastatingly wrong in outcome, just has to end. And you can't have politically one political party in Britain in opposition saying it'll be slightly not as nasty as the current government in power, but not actually look at things that are going on within the UK. And what I'm talking about is the current Labour Party in the last month or so has said it now accepts the 2-child limit on children payment. So it's going in the opposite direction from being progressive. And you just simply can't accept it. You've just got to say, I'm sorry, we can't fall down this far on everything. Why does the current Labour Party in England do that? Because it's part of the process of everything going wrong. It's not just that you have people able to only heat their house for 1 hour a day. Your political parties begin to fall apart in a country that becomes shattered. But you can fight your way out of it, and we have examples. I can give you more. It feels bad to give positive examples when the overall message really is bad. But the worst thing is that so many people accept this as if it's inevitable. It's the only way it can be. Or even worse, this is good. This inequality will drive people forward. It'll create entrepreneurship at the top. It's okay if people in the city are very rich because they're going to invent new things in that science park, you know. And the worst one, why do they allow children to be hungry when they know from Scotland that you don't have to? There was a phrase in the past that hunger is more effective than the overseer's whip. You know, if you want people to take jobs they really don't want to do and not claim benefits because you can't live on them.
Well, I'll just say, I was working full-time as a district nurse.
Yeah.
And I'm in the same situation now being on benefits as when I was working full-time. I probably have more money now being on benefits than when I was working full-time as a district nurse.
Yeah, yeah. That.
Because I didn't have time if I was working full time, so I couldn't go to food banks or food larders, which is very different. Food larder you pay to go 3.
Yeah.
I'm just interested. Anyone here go? Do any of you go to a food bank or a food larder? Yeah. No. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also you've got your travel expenses, childcare. And also you overcompensate because you ain't got time to cook. So
Thank you very much. There was a gentleman that was going to ask a question, but before I go to him, I just wanted to say I'm surprised that there's not a mass exodus to Scotland because it's the first time I hear about this. It needs to be broadcasted. Can we have a question?
Yeah. What can we do as citizens to make this better? And how can we do things that are effective and not inadvertently counterproductive? If we've got time on our hands and we want to make it better, but it can be confusing to know whether.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard, isn't it? 'Cause I think when problems feel really big, it can feel overwhelming, and it's quite hard for people to know what they can do. I think there are things we can do in our workplaces if we're working, in our families, in our communities. So there's things we can do at different levels. I mean, we can all act politically as simply as voting, but more actively than that. I think the most important thing is to talk to people. There's so much lack of awareness, I think, of how bad things have got for so many people. And I think a sense of hopelessness about being able to do anything about it. And so I think sharing our experiences and sharing our hope of how some social solidarity can overcome things is good. But I think anything that engages people in the places where they live, community involvement, community activism, trade union membership, of course, can help. But I think it's important that we think about how we do that. It needs to come from a sort of genuine, authentic wish to support one another, rather than a sort of I'm going to go volunteer at a food bank kind of thing. I was asked to chair a commission on inequality in Greater Manchester, which had to do entirely online because of COVID. But I think I was struck again and again when talking to people who came to give evidence to that commission and to talk about things, how many good ideas there were out there in communities about ways people could join together to help one another. So I think those are the sorts of things that we should be doing. But I think talking to our local councillors, asking our local councillors about what we want to see locally, writing to our MPs. We just got a new MP, didn't we? I call him Harry Potter MP because he's the youngest MP in the House, and he's about 12. No, he's not 12. He overthrew a huge Tory majority in Selby and Ainsley in one of those by-elections. So we've got a new Labour MP in Yorkshire who we can write to about things. But before then, we had a really, really unpleasant Johnson supporting MP. But you used to write to him quite a lot, didn't you?
To give him more work to do.
But also, writing to your MP, it does matter actually. They do pay attention. They start to get a lot of communication from their electorate about a particular issue.
Yeah, just before I move it on to Richard, also as a city councillor, I think it's really important that people understand the political process. A lot of people are under this impression that if you're a city councillor, you have the power to do quite a lot. There's a lot of restrictions on local councillors from central government. So for me, as a city councillor, having come, who was encouraged by the Pride area and voted, especially after the Brexit issues around racism and basically constructing, telling people to leave. It was really, really interesting to engage a local electorate that would not, would be seen as apolitical. So it's really interesting because they saw me as somebody that would do something in their area. So now the dilemma is I'm now a city councillor and there's quite a lot of red tape
Yeah.
that I cannot, I can, obviously advocate on behalf of beings, on behalf of different things that are doable, but structurally, I cannot change a lot of things, and it's really, really frustrating because you then get the message that we are just like them, we are all the same, because people do not understand the political process. So for me, I would like to see more engagement from our communities in terms of understanding what the political process is about, in terms of what people also having more resident committees that can support local councillors, so that you have a really different outlook as to how we can change things in our communities. So,
I think so many people just feel completely disengaged from politics, from the political process. They feel disempowered, and we need to counteract that. I mean, I think what you said about people in Scotland sort of seeing one another as people belonging to the same community, we really have lost that to a great extent in England. So everything that we can do to overcome that, I do think is really important.
I think that actually the things I was talking about, the insecurities, the social insecurities, the worries about what other people might think of you, are disabling politically. I remember when I lived in a present of houses, there was a grounds committee, and I remember a working class woman who felt that she couldn't, I was trying to get her to stand for the grounds committee, and she said, it's not for the likes of us. And I think that kind of feeling is quite common. I remember during the miners' strike that the feeling of enablement, of efficacy, being able to do things, felt by, for instance, some of the miners' wives during that strike, because they played an important role in organising and providing food and so on, supporting the strike. I was then in Sussex, and several miners' wives started university courses after that. And a complete change from anything that they would have thought possible beforehand. So I do think that feeling of being effective, being able to get things done, the experience of doing things together, and breaking through the status things that separate us is really important.
Okay, I'll take Roy. Do you still want to ask a question? You had your hand up a while back.
I think my question was probably been somewhat covered.
Okay, thank you.
I became more and more pessimistic until Danny talked about Scotland.
Okay.
My provocative question was, when did statistics change anything?
Okay.
But yeah, maybe respond to that.
Okay. Okay. Before you respond, I'm going to take the lady next, and then I'll take the gentleman there, and then I'll get back to you, so that if it's a similar question, you can just cover them. Can I have a question?
I'd like to say something positive.
Yes.
It's not a question. I'm a social scientist by training. I'm an ex-social worker, but now I'm a very retired gardener. And it's got to do with what we can do to help. And a lot of what I believe the gentleman at the end has been saying about how people perceive themselves. I'm lucky enough to be, I'm extremely poor now. I'm on pension credit. I haven't got to the food bank yet, but I may do soon, because I spend my life working for social services and I'm poverty stricken as well. But I'm lucky enough to feel that I'm okay, so I don't care who I talk to or what I say or what they think of me really, because I've got to say I'm still here. What I do is I help at Oxford City Farm. I don't know if any of you know that. Yeah. Great. And there we try to teach people how to grow vegetables, how to look have heat in our homes, how to do all the other things. But we also see everybody as being of equal value. Everybody can do something. And I think it's up to those of us who've got that point of view, and I'm sure most of you have in here, to encourage those who feel, oh gosh, I can't do anything. Yes, they can. They can do something, and we'll find out what that is, and they'll help you to do it. Because that's the way you build confidence and you teach people to go further, to develop their skills and to make a contribution. Also to do with the climate thing, we can go out, we can help. I teach people to grow plants and green their areas where they live, green their streets. Where I live, all the community in COVID, all us neighbours got together, and we've actually, from just a cul-de-sac about twice the size of this room, we now have plants everywhere because we all got out and did it. And so when you walk up our street, it looks green and happy, as opposed to just brick. And there are small things like that, which is healthy living in an age of insecurity. Small things that everybody can make some contribution.
Thank you.
To the well-being of others.
Thank you. So I'll take your question and then I'll get back to... Can I have yours as well? Yours and then get back.
Yes, my question is directed to Richard about...
Can I just ask you to raise your voice a bit?
Okay, my question is directed to Richard regarding the effects of psychological poverty, really. Considering that, growing up, all what I knew was that behavioral economics and econometricians were working for the government. But nowadays, behavioral economics, they work for corporations, banks, which design products. The government outsource services, for instance, the social security net, those products are designed by corporations, and I think that their aim is to, the cognitive overload for people, so that we cannot think beyond our.
Sorry, I'm just going to come a bit closer.
Okay.
My hearing is bad.
Yes. Well, I want to say, what do you think the solution is for the psychological poverty that we talked about, where people spend on excessive on the things that are not really important, why I'm asking is because the behavioral economics or economists and econometricians, growing up, they, in the 70s, they worked for the government. But nowadays, they work for corporations, pharmaceuticals. They work for, social media to overload the society, so that we behave badly. Because when you're poor, whether you are time poor, you are likely to behave badly. Whether you are money poor, you are likely to behave badly. And they know that, and they design products deliberately for us to behave that badly, so that they can money out of us. So what do you think is the solution? Because they've got a huge role in the government now, these corporations. So what do you think the solution is?
Thank you. Can I just
Well, I think it's again where
just one more, and then we can just all of you just. What was the question?
Well, so mine is also a comment, not a question, but mine was quite quick. You mentioned in your talk that you wished you had some stats on energy consumption across kind of income inequality.
Yes.
I just grabbed from Carbon Brief, which is a really good website.
Yes.
In 2019, in British households, the richest 10% of households expended more energy on flights than the poorest 10% expended across all kinds of usage. So that's one of the really...
Okay, Richard?
Yes, and of course you're talking about the top 10%, but when you start talking about the super rich, a fraction of 1%, and they have and this relates to the question there, they have a powerful influence on what our concept of the good life is and what we are missing out on. And advertisers know so well about the things I was talking about. You know, that L'Oreal advertisement that ended up because you're worth it. I.e., if you don't buy this stuff, you're not worth it. An enormous amount of it is about appeal. That this product will make you look high status, it's exclusive, all that kind of thing. That endlessly playing into this. But I think that the position of the rich is important, as I say, because they have a demonstration effect. We aspire to be better off. It's other people's posher cars. And you might not think you're concerned much with the status of what you buy. But even when you start thinking, oh, my car or my kitchen or my clothing is looking a bit shabby, you know, that judgment that makes you do something about it is based on social comparisons and your ideas of society's norms. And it's incredibly wasteful. But I think inequality, and there are studies that actually show, as I said when I was talking earlier, that if you live in a more unequal area, you do spend more on status goods. And these things, it's called the Veblen effect, was Torsten Veblen in the end of the 19th century drew attention to these processes, but I think we're even more vulnerable to them now. And in a way, big business regards the whole of society as the system, what you have to squeeze money out of. And it's a thoroughly exploitative relationship, and I think the big corporations, the control they have, the amount they spend on lobbying, the extent to which they get laws made to suit themselves, the extent to which they manage to penetrate the committees that are meant to regulate, you mentioned pharmaceuticals, for instance, to get the regulations that allow them to produce and sell what they want. And that commercial power, that use of money, is absolutely central to what we're talking about. Slide, I'm casting us down again.
No, I'll answer the question about when do statistics change anything. I feel that the answer to that is that they do, but quite slowly. And they don't usually do it alone. And I think you get the most action and the most change and create the most sort of impetus for change when you combine statistics with stories. You do need both. You can't have one and not the other. And the sort of anecdote that brings that home to me is I mentioned the UNICEF statistics about child well-being. When the first report came out, it was 2007? Yeah. And it put the UK at the absolute bottom. This is when we had the last Labour government. And their reaction to that was to say, oh, well, those are just statistics. They're out of date. Well, they always are, right? Statistics take a while to be gathered and cleaned and all of that. They're out of date and they're just statistics. They don't really tell us what people's lives are like. And UNICEF UK, which is a slightly separate charity, said, all right, we'll go and look at what families' lives are like in more and less equal countries. So they did a piece of what in university we call qualitative research. So it's not numbers, it's talking to people, getting people's lived experiences, and they talked to families and they followed families around in Spain. and in Sweden and in the UK, and they made beautiful films about it, and they wrote a report about it and showed in that work how damaging inequality was to family life in the UK. And when that report came out, the government said, those are just stories. They haven't got any statistics. So, you need them combined, I think. Can I just finish? One of the projects that I've been tangentially involved in over the last couple of years is a project that's run out of the University of York that started during COVID and was called COVID Realities, and now it's changed its name to be Changing Realities because life moves on. And it's about understanding the lives of poor families. But as well as listening to them, it asks, what questions would you like research, and how can you help us study them? And it also trains people, if they wish for it, because not everybody wants to do this, but if people want to, it trains them to be an advocate and to be able to go to a parliamentary committee and give evidence, or do a media interview and be an active voice for their own experience and that of their community. Now that's the kind of research project I think that can create the kinds of stories that can sit along the shocking statistics and help to create change. So that's my answer.
Can I just add something quickly to it before you come in, Danny? I think there is a difference between the parties. The Conservatives have for a very long time disliked social sciences, social science research, academia, and are largely ignorant of the things we've been talking about today, the causal pathways, the effects of austerity on death rates. They deny it when they do hear about it. The Labour Party, certainly under Blair, he believed in the research and knew the research on the effects of child poverty and made that an objective to try and deal with it. Thatcher even insisted on what we used to, the research funding body called the Social Science Research Council. She didn't like science being in there, social science, so she changed it to the Economic and Social Research Council, got rid of the word science. Symbolic of their dislike of this kind of work.
Thank you. Danny?
Yeah, it's... Yeah. Well, let's disagree on one. I think Tony Blair knew it mattered, but he didn't realise that what he was doing wasn't actually going to reduce child poverty. Anecdotes are more effective immediately. So I'm reading a book about super yachts at the moment. And I've only read the first 20 pages about super yachts. But about 10 pages in, it talks about Richard Horton, who I think was the editor of the Lancet. Is he still the editor of the Lancet? Can't be. Okay. But saying that we shouldn't talk about super yachts, it doesn't matter, the excesses. And then this book is all about why we should care about super yachts and to do with climate and behaviour. And there's a series of measures of them. And one is about how big the shower heads are in the shower. And they get you on bigger and bigger shower heads. And then it becomes a rain room, apparently, right, where it just rains. And then, of course, there's always one that shocks you. This carries on, and it's if you're a proper billionaire, it's not rain, it's champagne. And then the question, can you work out what the question next is?
What kind of champagne?
No, is it warm or cold? Anyway, but we kind of laugh, but you're going to remember the rain champagne. You know, that's what they're spending their money on. That's telling us we're almost near the end.
Yes.
Roy's goaded us. The Tories do know statistics matter, which is why Thatcher cut the Office of Population and Census Statistics by 25% its budget within 2 years of coming into power. They always cut. Francis Maude was the Cabinet Office Minister who wanted to cut the entire census in 2011, just before it. Luckily, we privatised the processing to Marconi Mission Critical Systems, an arms company, who are going to process the forms, and cancelling the census would cost more than carrying on. So don't underestimate the nastiness of some of these people. You know, they wouldn't be cutting these bodies as fast as they do. Whereas in the past, in that period where things got better, we had lots of collections of data. They're most effective where they change your opinion. So Charles Booth is the son of a shipping magnate who didn't believe it when somebody tried to tell him how much poverty was in London. He said, no. And because he's a rich man in the 1880s and 1890s, he set up a survey of London to count child poverty and poverty in general, and discovered it was worse than they thought. He employed Beatrice Potter, later Beatrice Webb, who helped draft the clause for the Labour Party, who employed a young man called William Beveridge as a researcher who went on to do a report full of statistics, but was influenced by somebody called Ward Pember Reeves, who wrote a book called Around About £1 a Week in 1913, which was full of tables and a bestseller, like later on bestseller, 2009, 2010, they have a bestseller, full of graphs. You did the graphs because people don't like numbers of tables. Harold Wilson increased the budget for collecting statistics. So the 1971 census was the biggest we'd ever had. And what kind of questions did it ask? Have you got hot running water? Because we were still clearing slums and we needed to know where things weren't working. But I'll just end with an anecdote. It's very hard to prove these matters. But the best political speech ever for the statistics is the speech that Nelson Mandela gave, which he was allowed to give by law before the judge was allowed to decide whether to kill him or not at his trial. So it's a speech well worth reading, because Nelson Mandela does not know whether the judge is going to put the black cap on at the end and decide he's going to be hung. Doesn't stop Nelson Mandela. He begins his speech, and then for somebody like me, he starts quoting lots of numbers, of which the one I remember the most is that the average amount of money spent on the education of a white child in South Africa was 6 times greater than the amount being spent on a black child in South Africa, when trying to explain why he was doing what he was doing. Now, I can't prove to you that quoting statistics like that might have changed the judge's mind or not, but these things are used by people who care, and people who don't care hate statistics. Yeah, and I suspect it matters. Yeah.
Oh, that's a great one to end on. We now have at least 8 minutes left. Can I just have the last?
Well, there are some questions that have come in from our online audience as well, frantically.
Oh, okay.
So, if you look online, thank you very much, Kenneth and Alex. So, Kenneth was joining us from the US and talking about how in Pittsburgh they've also tried a way of getting regular payments kit, and that has been stopped. So they asked the question, why do Anglophone societies devalue our children so much? But to end on something a bit more positive, a great idea. Alex Scott Samuel, thank you very much, Alex. Would the panel consider using video games to promote equality in our societies? Another one of those good ideas you were making.
Shall I start? I gave a lecture on children once, and I started with a map of the world and little quotes from travel books, like travel guides for people who are going to that country, for people travelling with families. And Italy, come, your children will be welcome everywhere, in restaurants, in shops, and all of that. Remember, we're all around the world, and then the British guides sort of say, keep your children seen and not heard. I don't know if it's entirely Anglophone, but we do have a less than embracing sort of attitude to our young people. And I don't quite know how we sort of counteract that. But again, I think part of it is the statistics. If you actually ask people, do you care about children, most of them will say yes. And I think the evidence that, if you invest in children, if you support children, that it's good for the whole society is really incontrovertible. So we need to be using those statistics. Hi Alex, it's nice that you're joining us online. I think video games are an excellent way to start trying to disseminate information about statistics, to try and engage young people in thinking about alternative societies. I do know that there are researchers at the University of York who are working on exactly these sorts of things, and there's a big digital civics program at the University of Newcastle where early career researchers are trying to think about using digital means to promote social justice, get people engaged in various things, and games is often a good way to do that. You can come up with games where you ask people to build alternative ideal societies and start to think about how you achieve them. So yes, games, more games please, just don't make me play them. I'm absolutely rubbish with that kind of, I'm the wrong generation.
Anyone else wants to?
Right, yeah, I do. Yeah. I do want. My worry about video games is that my two sons, the main thing they've learned from video games is how to be extremely effective if ever given a weapon. And my daughter has no interest at all. But it's a really interesting question from Alex. People have been trying this in many ways for many years before video games. The most famous example is trying to create a game which shows you that the people who get rich, it's mainly luck, right? And you think, oh, that's going to work. You might think it's not going to sell well. This is the most effective game ever for sales. And it's supposed to teach people that capitalism is bad. And this is a game where you get a little dog, a little ship, a little lion. You roll some dice, and you go round, and you get property. You're given an equal amount of money at the beginning, so you'll start off level, and it's called Monopoly. Now, the tragedy of Monopoly is that rather than teaching people that it's mainly luck, when you play it, you think it's your skill. Well, you do. Even though, if you play it this Christmas, you'll notice that actually it isn't the same person always wins. The youngest occasionally wins. You might pretend you're letting them. But it is the dice, mainly. So you two have written far more about this. That we have a tendency to ascribe things that happen to us because of good luck or not having bad luck as being due to our incredible ability, including winning at Monopoly. And when we lose at Monopoly this Christmas, we go, oh, if only I'd done that, or, well, it's the dice. And that's what worries me about video games for inequality, is that the danger, and you could just see it, of children going, right, this is a kind of simulation about society, which one do you want? And the aim of the game is to say, can we all be nice and cooperative to each other? But the tendency to want to kind of beat everybody else might be there. And it's these psychological issues about, it's learning how to cooperate and to resist that temptation to be a bit greedy. My kind of bottom line concern on this is I think there are greedy people in all societies and at all times. Those countries in the world that do best, and particularly in Europe, are the ones that control the greedy. And when we were doing really well in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't that we stopped being greedy, we just knew what they were like, and when they tried to be greedy, we controlled them, we taxed them really highly. When things go really badly wrong, as they have in Britain now, we put the greedy up on pedestals, and we say, look at them, aren't they brilliant? They must have worked really hard to get all that money. £4 million a year for the average chief executive officer of a FTSE 100 company. But we should learn from the failure of Monopoly to make the video game better.
Thank you. We've really run out of time. I'm not going to take another question. Sarah, do you want to say something?
Well, I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming, for your questions, and you made me think. I'm writing lectures in my head as I listen to your questions. Sorry, Jabu, you're getting them soon. Thank you very much to our panel. I love the fact that, yes, there have been some difficult things, some miserable things, some challenging things, but actually there are good ideas, there are things we can do. And so that's what I'm really proud to be part of, working in public health. because there is stuff we can do about this. If you want to find out more about public health, we have public health social media channels where we share interesting things and debates about public health. Just search for Oxford Brookes University Public Health Society. And also, please do keep an eye on our Eventbrite, because we do lots of things with the community as well as academic things in order to improve health in all of the ways, the small ways, the little things we can do, including monthly menopause cafes, and we also have Zumba groups to work with communities during pregnancy. So, thank you very much, and I hope to see you all at another event soon.